All right. Well, the William W. Hay Railroad Seminar Series is sponsored by the National University Rail Center here at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And on behalf of all of us, we thank the U.S. Department of Transportation for their ongoing support of this series. It's greatly appreciated by those of us here on campus, as well as those participating via the internet. Like other U.S. railroads, the BNSF has experienced dramatic changes in rail traffic patterns over the past decade. Of particular significance is the major increase in traffic on their northern region, driven by growth in agriculture and, of course, the development of new crude oil traffic from the Bakken Formation. As a result, BNSF is making substantial capital investments to expand the capacity of its infrastructure to handle this new traffic. This presentation will provide an overview of the work completed to date and future plans. Our speaker will discuss certain types of capacity constraints and how they interact with existing infrastructure, resulting in different solutions. He will also discuss planning challenges due to the unpredictable traffic demand, as well as political, economic, and other factors affecting these projects. Our speaker, Dan Peltier, is a project engineer with BNSF's Engineering Services Department. He completed his BS in computer science at Princeton University and then worked for Oracle for 7 years as a business software developer before deciding that his true passion was railroad civil engineering. Consequently, he came here to the University of Illinois in the mid-2000s, where I was privileged to be his advisor with regard to his master's degree studies. He completed an excellent thesis, which I brought with me and forgot to bring to the front, but Dan can hold it up. Very nicely done work on investigating failure modes of bonded insulated rail joints, which is a significant problem for the railroads. Upon graduation, he joined BNSF as a management trainee in the track maintenance department and worked for 2 years as assistant roadmaster for BNSF's Twin Cities division. Among other duties, he supervised construction of track improvements for the then new North Star commuter rail service. In fall 2010, he joined the Engineering Services Department at BNSF as a project engineer, where his primary responsibility is the design and management of capacity expansion projects and other civil engineering elements of this required in the area. Please join me in welcoming our speaker today, Daniel Peltier, who will present the William Hay Railroad Engineering Seminar entitled BNSF Expansion in the Upper Midwest.
Thank you, Chris. It is wonderful to be back. In fact, the last time I was here was 6.5 years ago, shortly after I'd finished my master's program. And I actually came back to give a William W. Hay Railroad seminar over in Granger Library on my master's research. And I'm sure that many of you who were there remember every minute of it. And I will tell you that this is going to be a very different presentation. This will be light on numbers, light on science, light on graphs. What I wanted to try to do in this presentation is to convey to everyone here kind of a flavor of the stuff that we do, the variety, the complexity of what it means to actually try to add capacity to your railroad infrastructure, especially when you're trying to accommodate increased demand in freight transportation, which, unlike, for instance, passenger transportation, can grow quickly and unpredictably as markets change. So I'll give you a real quick overview of where I'm talking about, go through kind of where the projects we've had have been over the last few years, just physically where they've been located, and then go through a few different kinds of projects we've done and try to give one quick example of each, and then give my soapbox stuff at the end. I do have a lot of slides. I'm going to try to go through them quickly. However, it is fine with me if we don't get to all of them. So please, if you have questions and you want to stop me and ask a question, feel free to do so. I'd rather talk about what you want to talk about than get through necessarily everything that's in the presentation. So BNSF, this is BNSF's northern region, roughly speaking, and I don't want to spend too much time on it other than to point out that it spans roughly from Chicago to the Pacific Northwest. The region I'll be talking about in more detail is this area here, which, as you can see, is not only connected to Chicago and the PNW, but also has lines that go south towards the Texas-Oklahoma area and the Gulf of Mexico. More specifically, this is the region I'm going to be talking about, partly because it's where been the most interesting place to be railroading for the last few years, but also because it's where I work, so I know something about it. We do have a lot of stuff going on in other places as well. I just am not qualified to present on it, so I thought I'd talk about this instead. Some of the high points here: Minneapolis-St. Paul is here, Chicago is down here. Duluth, Superior, important ports there. Fargo, Minot, Grand Forks, North Dakota. Williston, North Dakota, way over in the western northwest corner of the state, which is the center of the oil services industries. That's where they tend to have their headquarters and their main shops, etc. Whereas I guess I would say Minot is kind of on the eastern fringe of the Bakken development, and it serves as kind of the commercial and business center for much of the region. Roughly what's going on is a huge increase in traffic. Since 2009, traffic into North Dakota has basically doubled. Traffic out of North Dakota has basically tripled. And every dot on here represents a place where we've either had a new or expanded customer facility come online. A lot of those in the Minot, where you see sort of between Minot and Glasgow and between Bismarck and Forsyth, a lot of those are related to oil. But even the oil, it's not necessarily shipping oil. We ship a lot of sand, we ship a lot of pipe, and I believe we ship a fair amount of sort of building supplies and everything just to deal with the construction that attends an oil boom. However, you also see that we also have dots all over the place, and most of those don't have anything to do with oil. What those have to do is a agricultural industry in that part of the country that continues to grow. Improvements in crop technology, some changes in the way, sort of continuing evolution of how product is shipped, have resulted in some big years for agricultural shipments as well, which they're not as big a percentage increase as, say, the increase in crude by rail, but in absolute volume terms, I'm not going to say larger or as large, but they're big. I don't remember whether they're larger, as large, or slightly less in absolute volume, but they're big. So year by year, in 2011, which is my first year as a project engineer, we were sort of focused on some improvements. We made a few improvements in the Minot area to deal with the sort of nascent oil boom. And we also made some improvements along our north-south corridor because we thought a lot of that oil was going to be going to the center and in the Texas-Oklahoma area where traditional domestic oil markets were. That did not actually pan out that way, by the way. So we did some in 2011. We haven't done a whole lot there since, although we have some more in the works. 2012 to 2014, scrambling to catch up to demand. That's probably not a fair statement. We were working hard. We had traffic exceeded our forecasts. The ever unpredictable grain harvest came in big for several years in a row. We had some really rough weather last winter, and all of it combined to put a huge demand for, or I should say, to create a huge discrepancy between how much people wanted to ship and how much we were able to ship. Led to some service problems. But I guess I want to point out that we had been working on those, on expanding capacity before that happened. But it's, unfortunately, we do not have the perfect crystal ball, and we did not, we're not able to get ahead of it until, well, I guess I would say we still aren't ahead of it. So 2011, like I said, we had the project up in Minot, but then a lot of it was on this north-south line down through Sioux City, Iowa. 2012, we start working on our Glasgow subdivision, which extends from Minot to Williston and actually out to Glasgow, Montana. But Minot to Williston is kind of the part that goes right through the heaviest and the earliest of the oil developments. To solve problems there, and then we kept doing more in 2013 and more in 2014. And you see that most of this is all concentrated right there in North Dakota. That's where we had the biggest mismatch between the traffic that people wanted to ship and the infrastructure that we had in place. Coming into 2015, having blessedly had a relatively mild winter so far, we're in much better shape. We've added a lot of capacity in North Dakota. We have to continue our biggest project out there, which I'll talk about in a little more detail on, which is a large double-track project on that Glasgow subdivision from Minot to Williston. And we have some additional CTC to install. I'll take a brief side note to mention that we've delayed, I think, and I don't have the inside baseball story on this, but the impression I get is that we've probably delayed some signal work, some signal improvements, some signal capacity improvements, just because of the sheer volume of signal work we've had to do to implement PTC. We are starting to turn the corner on the signal infrastructure side of PTC, and I think that we're going to probably start to see some additional signal improvements aimed at capacity as we start to free up some of our people to do that. So we're kind of working on North Dakota. We've kind of got that sorted out, at least for now. Still have more work to do, but we're on a good path. The next challenge then is, now that all this traffic can move out of North Dakota, it moves right into Minnesota, and we have to make room for it to flow through Minnesota. And so that's really the focus this year, is to add capacity the rest of the way down to Chicago. So this is where our projects are in 2015. The green lines just being CTC projects, and the blue dots still being track improvements. So to go through, and of course you can categorize these in different ways, but I'm going to sort of talk about several different types of projects that we do. And the first broad category is simply line expansion. You have trains that need to move from point A to point B. How do you get them where they need to go? And the prototypical example of expanding line capacity is if you have a single track line, you build a new siding. In some cases, you might extend an existing siding that's too long for modern trains or something like that. And I guess the only point I want to try to convey by talking about this project is how once you've made the decision to add a siding, you've only begun really my job, which is first and foremost, before you can do anything else, figure out where the siding is going to go. Our top priorities are sort of given on this slide. I'm not going to say necessarily what order they're in, but we spend a lot of time looking at impacts to crossings. If you have a busy public road, you do not want to build a siding across the busy public road and have the train sitting there waiting for meets, blocking the crossing. You will get phone calls every day. On the other hand, you want to place the siding where it will do the most good for your operational problems, and that is directly between the two adjacent sidings, more or less. And so there's a little bit of tension there. You sort of find yourself going to that midpoint and starting to look for any areas that don't have crossings. The other things that you have to take into account when you're building, the way we've been building at least, and the way railroads typically do, you have to look at long lead time things that are going to keep you from meeting your schedule. Right away can be slow. Sometimes it can be quick. Sometimes it can be very slow. The first project I started on when I started in 2010 just got built about a year ago, and all that time was spent in right-of-way acquisition. It wound up going through condemnation, which is quite unusual. And of course, minimizing cost. You want to avoid large cuts, large fills, and especially large bridges. So those are kind of what we look at. And here's an example. Someone said, go build a siding on our Hillsboro subdivision between Hillsboro and Thompson, North Dakota. There's one siding in between there, but it was only about 5,000 feet long. It was not long enough to hold the kind of trains that we were running. On the other hand, you have this problem that there were roads on every section. We had a north-south line, and there were roads running along every east-west section line, township or county roads, literally for 50 miles in a row. And so we immediately started looking for, is there one of those roads that we think we could get away with closing that's located close enough to where we need this siding? So I was driving around. This is actually after I drove in on this grass road for quite a while. I actually saw these crossbucks from half a mile away through some tall weeds. Drove in there and found this crossing. I will say we wind up doing this on a lot of projects where we target a road and we see if we can go close it. This is the only one we've actually succeeded in doing so. People like their roads and their crossings. Obviously, this road is not doing anyone any good. It's a safety hazard. It's a maintenance problem for the railroad. It's everything that shouldn't be there. And fortunately, the township more or less agreed, and we came to an amicable agreement to close the crossing. And so immediately we knew where to put our siding just based on that. I'll try to do this on here so people following at home can see. The old siding went from about here to about here. Our new siding our siding extension was actually basically building a new siding next to where the old siding had been, because that's where we could get a road closure. In the process, we said, well, we don't really need to keep all of that track on the old siding, and it all would have needed to be upgraded, since obviously it hadn't been used much and was not in very good shape. So we actually removed the track between here and here and left just enough to switch a little industry that was located off the siding. In retrospect, if you ever find yourself in this situation, don't do that. Upgrade the track, bite the bullet. We wound up creating big problems during the construction process, because you see the old siding location was right next to a road crossing. It was easy to get to. The other one was in the middle of a long stretch, a mile-long stretch. And to get in, construct that new turnout and everything, I thought I was so clever. I said, well, we'll just, ultimately have an access road down to that switch when we take that east end of that track out. Well, they didn't really want to take the east end of that track out before we built the new siding and put it in service. So it was difficult to get in there and build that. So keep that in your mind. Dan says don't do that. But we wound up with a siding that's long enough to hold any of the trains we run out there, and without blocking any crossings except for one farm crossing, which, if you've been out there, you know that they're used probably for about 2 weeks a year during planting and harvest. Oops, wrong way. I'm going the wrong way. I must be holding this the wrong way. That's the problem. So on the other hand, the other, I guess, prototypical example of line expansion is to add double track where you have single track. And we wound up doing that on our Glasgow subdivision, but it took us a little while to get there. 2012, we added one siding. And while we were in the process of building that one siding, we were planning out to do 3 new sidings in addition to that over the next 3 years in 2013, 14, 15. That was the plan as of, as best I could find going through my records, I know it was the plan as of August. I know that by November, the plan was to build all 3 of those sidings in the following year, build them all in 2013, which was a challenge because we did not have any of the engineering done or anything, did not have the required wetland delineations completed, which you can't do when they're under snow and so forth. So we had to work hard to get the engineering done on those in a timely manner. So the following spring came before we could even get people out there really working on these 3 new sidings. The word came down, we're going to finish those sidings, but we're also going to double track the whole subdivision. And they wanted to do it over the next 3 years, so we're in the middle of that now. But in 2013, they wanted us to build as much of the grade for the following year as we could. So we'd build the 3 new sidings, put them in service that year, plus build the grade for about 40 miles of double track that we'd then lay the following year. Okay, you want us to build a second track and you want us to start on it tomorrow. There are some questions we have to ask, like where? There's 2 sides, and oftentimes neither of them is perfect, but you have to figure out which is better. And then when you do have an obstacle, such as a large wetland or something, you have to figure out, is avoiding that obstacle make up for the difficulty of having to transition your tracks to have the new construction on different sides? What do we do with existing sidings? Do we want to just tie them into the double track? Do we want to keep any of them there for staging trains or having faster trains overtake slower trains and so forth? What right-of-way do we need and what permits do we need? And those are hard questions because to know the answer to that, you need to know where you actually need to work, where your grading limits go to. And to know that, you have to have something resembling your final construction plans. So these are long lead time items that you can't start until you have the engineering up to a certain point. So in many cases that year, we actually wound up jumping the construction around a little bit based on where we had right-of-way and where we had permits and where we needed permits. Fortunately, we had an excellent contractor working for us. Ames Construction did a fantastic job on this project and had worked with us enough to know that what the railroad wants is for them to get it done, and we're perfectly happy to hop around as needed in a way that we could both live with. Let me back up a second there, and I guess this is as good a time to mention this as any. When I talk about the contractor, I'm talking about the grading contractor. We always contract out all our own dirt work. We contract out our dirt work for new construction. We generally contract out new bridge construction. However, the vast majority of the track construction is actually done by BNSF employees. Signal is has an arrangement these days that kind of splits the burden a little bit between contractors and employees. So this is what it looks like overall, and this is only half of the Glasgow sub, but like I said, it's the part that concerned us most from Minot, over here in the east end, to Williston way up here. And what you see on this, the blue lines are places where customers operate facilities. They either, in some cases, lease a small amount of track from us, but in most cases have built their own track to receive or load rail cars. The red lines are capacity expansion projects that we completed between 2012 and 2013. 2012 and 2013. We built you can see the 4 new sidings that we talked about, and as well as some improvements up in Williston Yard. And then the solid green lines are areas that we graded in 2013 and started laying track in, I think it was February of 2014. And the dashed lines are work that we did most of the grading for this year and will lay the track for next year. Or I'm sorry, that we did the grading for in 2014 and will lay this year.
I bet track laying in February 2014 was fun.
Yes. Yes. It was. Fortunately, I didn't have to go there and do it. We had another guy. We finally realized that we had to hire someone out in Minot and could no longer cover that completely out of the Minneapolis office, so that poor guy had to go out and deal with that. But in all honesty, Chris, in some ways it had its advantages versus trying to do it in the spring. And I'll talk a little bit about that, real briefly touch on that in a second. But right away, this is an interesting problem you run into in a boom town or a boom area. We needed to buy about 37 parcels of property. Most of that was in Montreal County. Montreal County had, I guess I would say, a rather quaint arrangement for how you get title work done. It involved one county employee who did it for everyone. Yes, sir. Go back to the previous slide, yes, sir.
So the small, I don't know exactly what they are. The small sidings of like 1,000 feet that are exactly opposite each other. What are those for?
So the small tracks that you see, for instance, near milepost 25, those are set-out tracks. If the car has a trips a detector, and I guess the detectors are not on this depiction, but if there's a trips a detector showing that there's a mechanical defect with a car, and the car has to be set out, and the train usually has to proceed at an extremely slow speed until you can get it there. So you want to have these spaced every so often, so that you don't tie up one of your main lines with either a train going 10 miles an hour or a car setting out, waiting for the mechanical department to get there. And then the other, and in some ways maybe even the more, to some people more critical function, is they serve as a place for maintenance gangs to tie up at the end of the day. As you can imagine, the people who approve these projects focus a lot more on train movement. So we tend to refer to them as set-out tracks if we want to keep them in the plan. So anyhow, the solution is basically we had to go and build a lot of railroad on land that we didn't own. We couldn't own it because we couldn't get the title work done. And that actually is not so bad. We actually kind of do that routinely. You have to have, you know, some sort of contractual agreement with the owner that gives you the right to do what you're doing. It has some risks that we ran into. There were cases where landowners had easements across their property, third parties owned easements across their property that they may not even have known about and certainly didn't tell us about, that we had to go back and kind of deal with those third-party interests after the fact. Fortunately, I think we've gotten all those worked through. But the alternative would have been not building a railroad on land that someone was willing to sell us. So this is what we did. And it worked out, I think, okay. Some other challenges in addition to right-of-way: short construction season and spring road restrictions. I assume they probably have those here in Illinois, but they have them in a big way up there. Usually for about 2 months every spring, no heavy trucks can operate on most of the roads in the state without paying a whole lot for a permit. Especially where we were working, where most of the roads are gravel-topped. So that's two months a year where if you don't already have your contractor's equipment in place, and if you can't build out of material that's entirely on site, you're basically not working. And that follows this, 4 months or whatever where the ground is too full of frost to get anything done. And then even earlier in the winter, before the frost really sets in, you still have the problem of moisture conditioning and compacting the soil when the surface water freezes. If you try to water down gravel to get correct compaction or anything, it'll freeze before you can compact it. So the seasons and the and temperature-related stuff are a big impact on the schedule up there. Wetland permitting, we went through a number of wetlands, some of which we needed federal permits for, some of which we didn't. The ones that we did need federal permits for, all those permits were pending when Congress and the President couldn't agree on a budget deal and the federal government shut down. The people who process those permits are not considered essential government employees and were home for a week or whatever and came back with that much more of a backlog. And I can't speak from having personally talked to them, but I know if I were them, I probably would have come back with a morale problem too. So that slowed things down a little bit. Just in general, the number of wetlands, some of which were large, some of which were small, most of which were what are called prairie potholes. So it's just simply a depression with no outlet where water collects. A lot of those don't have the same regulatory requirements, especially in the state of North Dakota, that a larger body of water connected to a navigable waterway does. But just simply from a construction standpoint, it presents some challenges building through them. Manpower shortages. It's hard to find people who are qualified to work who don't already have a job that pays higher out there. And this has been a big problem for our, or I should say a big problem, it's an issue that our maintenance people have had to deal with for several years, finding qualified people who are willing to work for the railroad in that region. And the way we've adapted to that is that given how much new construction we're doing, way more than we were certainly 2008, 2009, and given the need to mobilize resources to some of these places, we've actually added system construction gangs for the first time. We kind of had system gangs that went along with the track laying machine before. We've not had system gangs to go all over the system and put in turnouts and do track shifts and things like that associated with new construction. We reached a amicable agreement with the union to allow us to put on some of these non-traditional construction gangs that could go system-wide. In 2013, I think we added the first one. 2014, we had 2. And I believe this year we have either 4 or 5. Not just operating in this region, but throughout the system, because it turns out that if you have the same group of guys doing the same thing, doing some of this tricky, non-standard work that the locals may never have done, it's actually better to have people doing that all year. And whenever you have an expansion project, that puts a pretty severe strain on the local manpower. So even in places where they haven't necessarily had the same trouble filling jobs, and keeping people on, we're using these system construction gangs now to do a lot of the track work. And I want to briefly mention also that the person who's in charge of all of those new gangs and in charge of generally of track construction is a man named Matt Keller, who was a University of Illinois undergraduate who left a year or two before I got here. So he's doing great things at BNSF.
What did you say?
He's in charge. He's the director of construction.
He's in Fort Worth now.
Yep. So he not only has ultimate supervisory control over all these construction gangs, but he is in charge of all the planning to get the track construction done. If it's on the capacity expansion list, it's his job to make sure it gets done, and he's doing a fantastic job. Track window availability, that almost goes without saying, right? It's hard to get time out to work on the tracks when they're so busy. So this is an example of a picture that came in from the field just a couple weeks ago, actually. You can see the dozer is plowing through foot-thick ice. What they're doing there is they're building a dam. This spring they're going to have they're going to be boring a culvert under the tracks here. I can't see my cursor on here. Well, they're going to be boring a culvert under the tracks here, and so they're building themselves a little dam so they can pump it out and get that culvert in early in the season, before, just in case. Last year we had some high water issues here simply because of a wet spring, and so we want to be out ahead of this as best we can. Of course, the ground is probably frozen. When this picture was taken, it was -15. And it's safe to say that the ground is probably frozen solid enough that even a good-sized dozer like that would not cut it. So I think what he's actually doing is he's spreading dirt that was taken from another nearby hill to build the dam. I mentioned that there are a lot of wetlands. This is one of the larger ones. But that presents a little bit of a challenge to build through. This is one of the not quite as large ones, but still good size. And where are the yeah. Okay. Is that better? Okay. What you see is the wetland with the dozer pushing dirt down into it. Normally, if you're going to be building in water, you prefer to build out of granular material that is a little bit less susceptible to getting soft when it's saturated. In North Dakota, the bedrock is all 100 to 200 feet deep, and there is no crushed rock, unless you bring it in by train. And the railroad was kind of busy moving crushed rock for ballast and moving other products for certain other people out there. So we had to build out of what we could. Like I said, we had a good contractor. Fortunately, they had a little bit of experience working in North Dakota, actually quite a bit. They'd done quite a few highway projects as well as some other railroad projects. And they'd kind of got a good sense of how to get this done and still produce a quality product. According to them, at least, the key is to make sure that when your dozer takes that dirt that he pushes, it takes his new fill, that he's pushing down as he goes into the water so that the dirt is displacing all the muck on the bottom of the water and pushing it out ahead and keeping it out of the embankment versus allowing the dirt to slide over the top of what's there. So far, from what I've heard, we haven't had any significant problems in the first year that this has been in service. So, and when I say this, I don't just mean this wetland, but this entire project, which is just full of places like this. Yes, sir?
So if bedrock's 200 feet,
So if bedrock is 100 to 200 feet, what's above that? Is it a
in this part of the state, the soils are glacial, and so there are a wide mixture of different kinds of soil types. There's a lot of decent gravel.
so underneath the muck would be some gravel?
Well, there might be, or clays or silts. You really don't know. But there's no feasible way to get it out of there from the toe of the track without building shoring systems and stuff, which is not going to be practical over this length. And it's what the existing roadbed is built on. So it seems to hold up over time, I guess you'd say. But in terms of the stability during construction, it's not as nice as having some crushed rock to put in there. In the eastern part of the state, it's a little different. There all used to be a big lake in the post-glacial period that's filled in with some pretty bad muck. But out here, there's a mixture of different soil types, some of which are good and some of which are bad, and there's enough good stuff that you can make a go of it. I believe this picture shows us having built up to the edge of a wetland that we didn't yet have a permit to build through. So they literally built right up to the edge and stopped and went to work somewhere else. Came back and got this spot later. And I mentioned track window availability. I would say in some respects it was less of a problem than we thought it would be. This is a high priority project for the company, and they made it happen. The only caveat was that we had to do all of our track windows at night, based on just the schedule of Amtrak and the priority intermodal trains. But we routinely would get 2 track windows per week to put in turnouts, 6 hours each. Excuse me. With the exception being if there were production gangs doing rail or tie replacement anywhere else on the subdivision, then it was a little bit more of a stretch to get the windows. So that's line expansion. That's pretty straightforward. You have one track, you build another track next to it. Terminal expansion is, in some respects, a more interesting topic because it's a more complicated topic with a lot more variables, a lot more thinking about what you want to do to start with. This is a picture, a before picture from the east end of the lower departure yard of Northtown Yard. Northtown Yard is a hump yard in Minneapolis. It's our large hump yard that processes loose car freight for basically the entire northern region west of Minneapolis. The next yard is out in Pasco, or the next major yard is out in Pasco, Washington. And for those who might not be familiar, a hump yard takes cuts of cars, shoves them over the hill, and then computers control the cars into different tracks, and you sort the cars by where they're going to, and then you take those blocks of cars, you pull them out of those tracks, and you push them into your departure tracks. And once you've got all the different cars that you need for your train, you lace up the hoses so that the air brakes will work. You do your air brake inspection, you put the power on, and you depart. There's a little bit of a problem with the way the tracks were configured. Can anyone tell me what it is? There were 2 problems. I'll take either answer. Yes, sir.
You don't have a lot of options for really anything I see for parallel moves.
Exactly, no parallel moves. Every single move in and out of here, including every time they want to shove cars into one of these tracks and every time a train wants to depart, has to go through this switch here. Okay, so I guess I should clarify. These are the 5 departure tracks here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. These are tracks used for other purposes over on the edges. So all 5 of those tracks funnel through here. That's the number 1 problem.
So the hump yard is on the right?
Yeah, the bowl is over here.
Okay.
Yep. So they shove back out towards us, shove back in through this switch here. The other problem here is simply the track geometry. It had been kind of mangled through the years, probably as they'd replaced turnouts with turnouts that weren't quite the same size. Someone probably thought they were doing the right thing by replacing a number 7 turnout with a number 9 turnout or something like that, but introduced other problems in the process. Derailments happened, they had to get put back together in a hurry, whatever. I don't know the reason. I'm sure there's good reasons for all of it. But the net effect was that some division engineer at some point got tired of going and dealing with tiny derailments in this area and put a 5-mile-an-hour speed restriction on it. So all these trains that had to move through this one spot did it all at 5 miles an hour. We fixed it. It was a significant amount of work. It shut down the yard for 2.5 days, but we fixed it. You can see the new configuration has 2 parallel leads. You can access, certain pairs of tracks at the same time as certain other pairs of tracks, or certain tracks at the same time as you can access certain other pairs of tracks. You may not be able to tell, but those are all number 11 turnouts, which are much better suited for modern rail cars than number 9s were. Plus, it doesn't have the crazy reverse curves. Oh, absolutely. Yep. Pretty pictures, so I thought I'd show them to you. But it's a good example of how sometimes in a terminal you have just one spot that's really holding everything back. This is a huge yard. It's got all sorts of needs. But just by doing this one project, we made a measurable increase in the amount of traffic that this yard could process in a day. The other project, also in the Minneapolis area, that we're actually going to, well, we've begun construction on it now, is I guess it's also terminal expansion, but it's on the main lines. So just to be clear, the terminal doesn't just mean the yards. It means everything that happens where you have a bunch of rail lines coming together and a bunch of rail yards and a bunch of transfer moves and several different railroads operating over trackage rights and everything else. It's just as important to keep the main line flowing as to actually have your yard processes work well. I think there were times last winter when we learned that we had to stop building trains in the yard because the departure tracks were full and they couldn't get out on the main line. So the goal of this project is to take a line that had not been used very much, or has not been used very much for through traffic since the Burlington Northern merger or thereabouts. It's still being used. It's always been used. It's always been used pretty regularly, but it was mostly used for accessing a couple of intermodal yards that we have on it. It's used for some trackage rights trains. It's used for some routes from certain other lines to certain other lines that have to take it and so forth. But where possible, through traffic has traditionally taken a different route through the cities. That line is nearing saturation. We have the ability to upgrade this line and put it to work relieving some of that burden. Oh, I just turned that off. Good, it came back on. So this is what this junction node of St. Anthony Junction looked like in 1977. And I have to give credit for whatever local photographer, I'm sorry, his name is John Hill. I've never met the man, but he has a great set of pictures on this website. Was he? And he was very kind enough to allow me to use this picture in the presentation. This is what this junction looked like in 1977. Something like 10 diamonds, 3 of which had double slip switches associated with them. Of course, the control tower for the manual interlocking. And this is what's there today. I'm going to ask another question here. Can anyone tell me what the problem is with this track configuration? And I'll give you a hint. It's the same as the problem with the other track configuration we looked at earlier. All the trains have to go through this one piece of track between these 2 switches. Which is how you get rid of diamonds, right? You replace diamonds with switches and crossovers, and you save a lot on maintenance. And it was the appropriate thing to do, I'm sure, in 1982, 1983, whenever it happened. But it's a pretty severe bottleneck to trying to move through traffic through this area. Actually, east of here, we have 2 main tracks. Going west from here, we only have 1 main track, so that's kind of another bottleneck as well. So what we're proposing to do is double track that 2 miles of single track. And at this junction, we'll actually relocate the existing main line. Because right now we have 2 yards. One of them is on the north side of the main, one of them is on the south side of the main, and they're kind of next to each other, but on the opposite side of the tracks. They're both intermodal yards. They spend a lot of time each day moving equipment, either empty cars or loaded cuts of cars back and forth between the yards where they have room for it, where they have facilities to air test it and so forth. All of those moves today have to go through the main line. So we'll actually be rerouting the main line to the other side of one of these yards and creating a connection between the 2 that allows them to go through without having to go from one yard to the other without having to go on the main line at all. So that's a rough drawing of what it'll look like. For reasons I can't explain, this is actually seems to me to be easier to understand than just throwing the actual plan view up here. But the track that sort of comes in today and goes out this way, that used to cross on all those diamonds and now crosses just on that one little set of turnouts, we'll have to go through an extra crossover. But other than that, it pretty much works the same. We have 2 main lines, and then we'll have this other track on the south side that will get you between one yard and the other without having to cross the main line. Yes, sir.
So now, one question though would be, it looks like the road bridges going overhead were already double or triple wide, so this would have been a lot cheaper, right? But like, would there have been a difference had you had to redo the road bridges as well?
Yes. The question was, that it appears that the bridges all were wide enough to handle the extra track. Would this have been a very different problem if the bridge piers had been situated differently? The answer is yes. However, we did do a fair amount of designing around the piers that were there, but there was enough room in all to make it fit. And I don't think I have not yet been involved in a project where we had to actually go to a road authority and have them rebuild a bridge, which is good. because that would not happen on our timeline. So, you know, when a public agency talks to us about building a bridge over the top of us, we always insist on having extra room left to add tracks in the future, add access roads in the future, and so forth. We get a lot of pushback, but this is why. Because you never know what the future will bring, and it's generally speaking not at all practical to have to change how the bridge is in order to make our track project happen. Yes, Chris?
Related to this, I recently learned that UP is now saying they do not want intermediate piers either. In other words, the bridge span has to go all the way across. Is that also BNSF's position these days?
I can't quote you chapter and verse. Actually, we share a document on grade separation guidelines with the UP, so I believe the underlying official rule is the same. In general, our first preference is always to ask them to span from right-of-way to right-of-way on a large enough bridge. That's obviously not practical, and then we'll negotiate with them about how many piers or can we place the abutments within the right-of-way and so forth. We want these bridges to happen, right? We don't want, certainly if it involves grade separating and closing a crossing, and more generally, we really want to cooperate with the community at large. So we'll work with agencies, but you know, we have to at the same time reserve our ability to operate our railroad and preserve these corridors that in some ways are our most valuable asset. I mean, you can always remove and replace a track, but replacing a corridor through downtown or through from Minneapolis to St. Paul like this is not feasible. So some of the design challenges we had, maybe I should have put bridge piers on here, but what I did put is we have 6 railroads that use this track, and as best we could, we wanted to accommodate everyone's need, because usually in the process of making life difficult for one other railroad, it'll somehow eventually come back to us. And I don't mean in terms of revenge, but I mean in terms of if you gum up the system, it'll eventually cause consequences for us somewhere else. Where we could not do that, we had to look into some very old agreements about who exactly had what rights to what track, and is the thing that they're demanding that they be able to do, and the thing that we're demanding that we be able to do, which one of us actually wins in that situation. I'm going to flip back here real quick and just point out that the agreement that specifies which tracks the Union Pacific has the right to use is still printed on the map that shows the tracks looking like that. For whatever reason, it never got updated when the tracks turned into that. So it's a, you know, not my job to do that research, but it's my job to try to design around what tracks we have the right to use and what tracks we have to talk to other people about using and work out something with them. In keeping with that, we also have to work out traffic control. If we are using some track that another railroad is also using, how is this going to work operationally? Who's going to make sure that both railroads, or all 6 railroads, are talking to each other, and that one person isn't making a move that's going to frog in the next guy and cause backups throughout the region? So, you know, that's an interesting combination of people having to defend their own interest, and also, but at the same time, people having to make the whole thing work better, because we all share the same track and we all need to make it work. So you get some interesting problems. On the construction side, this project has some challenges just because of the tight quarters. We've got, you know, places where we're building new tracks in between existing tracks that are both live. We have limited access in and out. We have limited space in general in this corridor. On top of that, this is the oldest railroad in Minneapolis-St. Paul. It was the part of the first railroad built in Minneapolis-St. Paul area. It has a lot of history in the ground, and there's the potential for contamination in any of the soil that we excavate. And so even if it were easy to find people who need large amounts of fill dirt in the middle of a city, which it usually isn't, we would have to test this material before anyone would take it. And so we have to stockpile it and test it. We're already short on space, so finding space to put large stockpiles of dirt that can be tested, and then handling it twice to haul it out of there, you know, just makes the challenges related to tight space that much more acute. Phasing work to minimize the outages. I'm going to flip back here real quick and point out that none of these lines, for the most part, line up with where existing tracks are. We're not just building new tracks. We're taking one track configuration and wiping it out and building a new track configuration in the same place. Obviously, you want to do as little of that in a single window as possible. By doing some tweaks where we can put this turnout here and budge this track over here ahead of time and do this and that and the other thing, we've gotten it down to the point where we think we'll be able to do this with a 24-hour absolute window. That's still early planning phases. But if you had to do all of this without doing some preliminary prep work and some figuring out how you can tweak your design so that there's room to put this proposed turnout in without interfering with this other turnout that's already there, that would have been a much larger window. So we spent a while on that phasing. Accelerated schedule requiring winter work. We started the grading for this project last fall. We did not complete it. However, it is farther along than a lot of the construction projects, and so we've got these track construction gangs that need a place to go. They have to keep busy all year. They won't be able to finish our big expansion program. So they're coming our way earlier than I would choose to have them there. That's almost always true. So we have kept working on tasks that we can work on all winter. I give this as an example of some of the challenges in working in tight spaces. This is not Minneapolis. This is a project I did in South Sioux City, Nebraska, across the river from Sioux City, Iowa, last summer. But it has many of the same conditions that we expect to find on our St. Anthony project. In this case, there used to be a track in between these two tracks. It was in poor condition. It had old, small ballast. It was full of mud. Wasn't much to salvage there. So let's remove it and rebuild it. Sounds good on paper. And in fact, it is the right thing to do. Took me some convincing to ever do this again after what happened on this project, but I was convinced. You remove that muddy ballast, and under it you just find more mud. And you find more and more mud. And the only real solution is to dig that soft stuff out of there down as low as you can to the point where you hope that you're out of the influence of the heavy influence of the live loads going over it. There's a limit to how deep you can dig without undermining the adjacent tracks, which are both, well, in this case, actually, the track on the right is a live track. The track on the left we were able to take out of service during construction. In the project we're doing in Minneapolis, that will not be the case. We'll have to actually do a short amount of this work, or a short stretch of this work between two live tracks. So there's a limit to how deep you can dig. In some places, we could not dig deep enough. We put in 3 inches of crushed rock, rode the roller over it, and the muck heaved up 3 feet through the dirt, and you sank in it when you stepped in it. So we had to go find some bigger rock. And we did, and we got it worked out, but it was not a fun experience. And of course, in the process of digging as deep as you can, it's fine to dig this deep next to a track as long as you don't have a train on that track. On the other hand, we're expected to be able to do this work without delaying trains too much. So you have to be a little bit careful about how big a hole you open up and be able to get it backfilled when you know a train is coming. Not backfilled all the way, but backfilled enough to maintain some stability of that track next to you. Okay, how am I doing for time, Chris? You're okay. Well, people haven't started streaming out yet, so I guess that's a good sign. In addition to sort of building new track on the main line or tweaking your terminals a certain way, the other kind of project that we get involved in sometimes is just big picture operational changes that need some engineering support. Changes in traffic levels over the years sometimes require some operational changes to best utilize what you have, what resources you have. And if you go back a couple decades, I think you'd find that most of the projects that meet that description involved improving one line so that we could abandon or downgrade another. Recently, we've started to see that turn around in some cases. And now we're starting to have to upgrade those lines that have been downgraded before. And change our operational patterns to take advantage of those lines that weren't necessary even in relatively recent times, but which now are. The Midway subdivision would be one example of that. An even niftier example is one I'm going to show here. This shows the triangle of tracks between Fargo, North Dakota, which is on the east side of the state, Grand Forks, North Dakota, which is also on the east side of the state, directly north of there, and Minot, North Dakota, which, as I mentioned before, is on the eastern edge of the Bakken area. In 2011, this was where through freight flowed. Where through freight flowed. And what I'm not showing on here is that there were local customers along this top branch from Grand Forks to Minot. Amtrak ran along this branch from Grand Forks to Minot. But for the most part, through freight trains did not. Instead, through freight trains ran from Minot to Fargo via this cutoff that was built to save distance and time versus the original route through Grand Forks. This cutoff, I think, was built in the early 20th century. And ever since then, it's been our primary freight route. There was some traffic that ran between Fargo and Grand Forks and on to other points from there. But this KO sub, the one that runs diagonally from Minot to Fargo, had reached its capacity. And there weren't any easy fixes to improve it. There was no one space where you could build a siding. Building one siding wouldn't have done any good. You would have had to build 5 sidings because there were already, the sidings were pretty evenly spaced. On the other hand, the Devil's Lake sub, the one that runs along the top there from Grand Forks to Minot, was barely utilized. In fact, in 2008, the rising waters of the Devil's Lake Basin, which is a watershed with no natural outlet in the area, and tends to fluctuate over decades based on hydrological conditions. This water has now been coming up for several decades, and it had reached the point where it was threatening the tracks. And since we were not, as I said, we were barely utilizing it, we actually pulled our tracks from that segment and served customers from both ends. Amtrak continued running through end to end. The Hillsboro sub, the other piece there from North Dakota, from Fargo to Grand Forks, was kind of near capacity, but only because it did not have much in the way of sidings or anything on it. So there was room to improve that one. So what we're doing today is we're actually implementing kind of a directional traffic pattern. The KO subdivision still has trains going in both directions, but the majority of them are eastbounds. The Hillsboro sub from Grand Forks down to Fargo still has traffic in both directions, but the majority of them are we call them westbound, but obviously they mostly are going north. The Devil's Lake sub, at least as far as through traffic goes, is completely westbound traffic, except for Amtrak. So to support this, we had to make some improvements, but not nearly as what we would have had to go in and do, at least in terms of new track construction, what we would have had to go and do on the KO sub. So the first thing we had to deal with was this flooding issue. And that's a topic all on its own, and I encourage anyone who's interested to go take a look at the presentation that one of the consultants who worked for us on this project did at the 2013 AREMA conference on kind of phase 1 of the project, what turned out to be a 3-year project. But we had to raise 2 bridges and roughly 10 miles of track by varying amounts to get it up above the level at which the lake would actually begin to overflow its basin. With that taken care of, we still needed to do some upgrades on these tracks that had not handled much in the way of through traffic and were not set up to deal with it. So on the Hillsboro sub, probably we had the most acute need because, as I said, that has traffic in both directions. So we had to make improvements to existing siding, build some new ones, wound up with roughly 15-mile siding spacing on that subdivision. Devil's Lake sub, on the other hand, it really only has the westbound trains, and then there's a few poor little suckers who have to swim upstream against it. Unfortunately, one of those is Amtrak, so everyone has to get out of Amtrak's way. So we needed enough good sidings that trains could get out of the way of those few little things running in the wrong direction, hang out there while a train went by, and then take off again. So we wound up with being able to get by with just upgrading existing sidings. I think we extended one of them a little bit. But for the most part, what we did was we just made them CTC islands in what was a ABS territory, which means that they did not have to throw switches by hand. Hand throw switches in this day and age with no caboose present a problem for a train going into a siding. There's no one in the back of the train to reset the switch for the main line. If you're running mostly freight, that's an issue you can deal with because you can always stop the train that's coming in the other direction and line the switch back the way they need it to be. But when you're running Amtrak, that's not acceptable. The freight train has to be out in the clear and have the switch thrown back. So CTC was kind of the key to being able to start running significant amounts of westbound trains on here and still keep Amtrak going through. In theory, it's a signal project. In practice, we wound up installing 7 turnouts, rehabbing the rail on one siding, which turned out to be out of service due to rail condition. And by the time we built access road to all the new signal equipment, built berms for it and everything, we did if you look at the grading quantities in terms of fill, excavation, and gravel road base or subballast, it was about equal to the quantities we would have used on one brand new siding to get 5 or 6 projects done. So a lot easier than building new sidings, but a not insignificant amount of work for the track and civil side, as well as, of course, quite a bit of work on the signal side. So just a few thoughts I guess I wanted to share with you, and you certainly are free to leave if you don't want to listen to someone who's just kind of spouting off here. But you know, the railroad industry is a huge player in our domestic transportation market. We carry, I don't know, Chris, what percentage of all ton miles do we carry these days?
Like
42%. 42%. Despite that, though, in some ways, we're almost a little bit of a niche market, right? We ship a relatively small number of commodities between a limited number of origin destination pairs. It's a large number of origin destination pairs, but it's limited. It's nothing like, say, the highway network, where people routinely get on anywhere in the country and go anywhere else in the country. And many of those industries are kind of heavy industry. They tend to be very cyclical. They tend to have their ups and downs as markets vary. And so the demand for our services can turn very quickly. That makes forecasting the growth that you need kind of difficult. I think I'm not a traffic planner, and so I apologize. I certainly don't want to insult any traffic planners in the audience. But they have advantages that we don't in forecasting. You can kind of look at how urban areas are growing and get a sense for where you're going to need capacity in the future. You have time to do some environmental impact statements, get the construction in the next bonding bill, and so forth. Railroads tend to wind up having to act very quickly to keep up with these changes in markets. Rail infrastructure, on the other hand, is very expensive, and it's paid for mostly with private money. And so over-investing in the wrong place is just as bad as under-investing. You know, money that you throw away in a place that turns out not to, I shouldn't say throw away, money that you invest in a place that turns out not to wind up carrying the traffic you thought is money that could have been spent on something more critical. So forecasting is difficult. Getting your investment put in the right place is critical. The only way to deal with that is to act flexibly and rapidly. I think a lot of times you'll hear railroaders, including myself, constantly complaining about how we never know what the plan is for tomorrow. Everything seems to change. There's some truth in that, but there's a reason for that. And the reason is that this is how the business operates. There's no other way to do it. That's not to say we can't do better, and I think we are doing better, and we try to do better. But there's a certain amount built into that just in the kind of industry, in the kind of business that we're running. And I would say that people within BNSF are amazing at adapting to changed circumstances very, very quickly. And I think that's true of pretty much all the railroads. It's what we do. It's our bread and butter. Unfortunately, the world at large that we have to interact with is not always on the same time frame. And so that's why when I talked about sort of the challenges of doing work quickly, a lot of it had to do with what? With outside people, right? Outside agencies, outside landowners, permitting. Even beyond that, even within the company, the construction is more sensitive to small changes in the markets than maintenance is. Our track maintenance people like to plan out their work well in advance and keep the whole thing running smoothly. And it can really throw a wrench in it when all of a sudden we're asking for windows that no one knew was coming when they put the gang schedule together last year. So even within our own company, dealing with those people who are operating on a different time frame can be very challenging. On the other hand, I said we're getting better, and I really believe this, and I think, and again, I have no inside information to share here, but I think that BNSF is in a unique position among the railroads to be able to make some investments in a more strategic way. That doesn't mean that we'd make an investment that we don't know is going to pay off. It just means if we don't know exactly when it's going to pay off, but we know that it's a critical piece of our infrastructure, we have a little bit more flexibility to go ahead and plan and spend the money. We don't have to answer to Wall Street. We're privately owned by a guy who is looking for places to park his money, looking for places to invest it. I think that gives us an advantage. I think you've seen that in our record capital investments that we've made in the company over the past few years. So it's a great time and place for people to be where I am, doing what I'm doing. A little bit of advice. If you find yourself involved in designing, managing, or constructing expansion projects, whether you're a consultant, whether you're working for a carrier, whether you're working for a contractor, whether you're working with government, learn about railroad operations as much as you can. Learn about track maintenance, track construction, track train dynamics, what causes trains to fall off the tracks. Learn about signaling. You may not be designing any of those things, and there may be people reviewing your work who know everything about those. They probably don't have time to review your work in detail. They're very busy people. They probably will find the mistakes you made after you build it, and then you'll hear about it. So the more, one of the wonderful things I think about the program here at Illinois is the breadth of exposure you can get to the way railroads operate and what goes into building, maintaining, and running a railroad. And I encourage everyone to take advantage of that and to become a well-rounded person so that you can be the person who catches those issues before they get put in the ground. Thank you very much for your time. Do we want to stay and take some questions? Okay. Any questions? Yes, sir.
A couple. One thing you didn't address is any terminal capacity improvements or car storage. Is that something you're having to expand as well, given the traffic volume increases you're seeing?
Yes, we've done quite a bit of that. The question was, have we been expanding terminals in terms of car storage and places to put cars in the rail yards? Is that approximately correct? Yeah. We've been doing quite a bit of that. I did not give them as examples, but yes, we've added, we've lengthened tracks in Mandan, largely for the purpose of being able to put more what are called coal fill cars on, so unit coal trains, where they have bad orders and things like that, that you wind up with what's supposed to be a 110 car set and only has 100 cars. Place to store those 10 extra cars that then can be cut into the train, so they don't have to be somewhere else over the yard, in the yard where they're getting away. Williston, North Dakota, in 2012 was absolutely swamped. I said this is where all the oil service business is, and so there aren't any places loading crude oil right in Williston, but there are a lot of places receiving sand and pipe and chemicals and things like that. And this place was just absolutely swamped. It had this old yard, which we talked about tearing up tracks from, within a decade ago, which fortunately didn't happen. Some of them have been taken out back in the day, but they still had a small yard there. But yeah, we had to go and add 2 tracks to that, just so they would have more places to put the cars that they had to deal with for local customers. There are local trains running in that area now. Out on the branch lines in North Dakota that aren't anywhere near this area, they typically have 10 to 20 cars on the local. Putters up there every so often at 10 miles an hour and switches the Mon Pa grain elevators. The locals along the Glasgow sub tend to have 100 to 120 cars. So a lot of yards are not really set up to deal with that kind of traffic. The other interesting thing we wound up having to do in a couple cases was actually build staging yards. We don't generally like to be in the business of storing trains. We'd rather be in the business of moving trains. What we found was that some of our customers who, especially in the oil business where rail is sort of a new thing, we would wind up with situations where they had a train parked in their loading facility and maybe another one already staged there and then another one pointed at them. Well, they can't take it. We need someplace to put it. So we actually built staging yards on both ends of the Glasgow subdivision, one in Minot, which with a combination of building new tracks and actually rehabilitating some old tracks that have been gone mostly unused since they built the large switching yard outside of town. They had this other one closer into town. Barely long enough to hold unit trains. I think in the end we built option N3 alphabetically of all the options we explored for how to fit those tracks into that space. Out in Glasgow, North Dakota, on the other side, found a nice spot out in the country and built 3 staging tracks there as well. That was partly about, like I said, staging unit trains that customers aren't ready to take. Actually, part of that was also about maintenance. It was having a place to put trains during maintenance windows when it was a single track line, and it still is, and still will be probably 30 to 40% single track for the whole subdivision even after we're done. So one window there could really cause problems. You'd have to bring trains out and park them on sidings, which is not so bad, except then you just burned a crew. So if you have a yard right there at the crew change point, that can be a lot more efficient.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
I'll just make a comment about your Williston thing. I'm from the urban planning side.
Do you want to take the microphone? If you're going to make a comment, I don't want to put words in your mouth.
Okay, just to add a comment about Williston, I'm from the urban planning side, and partly Williston was such a boom so fast that nobody was prepared. It wasn't just the railroad. There's not enough houses. People were sleeping in their cars at Walmart parking lot. And how fast can you build houses to house people that would want to work there? And if you build too many houses, it's the same problem. You might overinvest in housing, and then as soon as something changes, it becomes half of a ghost town again. So, you know, it wasn't just the railroad that had a problem. It was everything. Williston just was not equipped for all the people, the water pipes, the housing, parking, all that stuff.
I absolutely agree with that. In fact, we wound up working with the Williston city engineer on that project, and I felt sorry for the poor guy. I don't know his story. I did not meet him in person. I never asked him. I just had this imagination in my head, or this picture in my head, that he probably was a local boy from the area who'd gone out to seek his fame and fortune, and now wanted to come back home and settle down in a nice, quiet job until retirement. And
think about the poor guy that had to do the land searches too.
yeah, well.
Well, and I was thinking of the same thing when you were talking about that county where you had to do all these title searches or whatever. I mean, if you think about what their normal rate of work for that is, it was probably an order of magnitude less than what they were suddenly subjected to.
Exactly. Now, if they hadn't just had such a goofy system to start with, it wouldn't have been an issue. But, yeah.
I had a question from your abstract, which is you referred to changes in the agriculture industry, and I understand obviously the bumper crops we had a couple of years. Are there some other sort of changes in the way things are?
Well, I think in general yields have been increasing.
So that's the change.
That's the change, and then the other changes. And I guess I'm not sure I could say. I would have difficulty telling you exactly how this has affected our capacity expansion, but I can tell you it's affected our operations, which is there more and more of the business is shifting to shuttle trains, which is our term for unit train of agricultural products. And and that I think goes along with the ever increasing size of the typical farm and everything as well. So I guess other than the sort of the secular increase combined with the cyclical or weather dependent or whatever you want to call it bump. Well, it's cyclical too, based on the prices that we've seen. More land has been put into production. Other than in general that extra traffic, now I have a little hard time saying how it ties into the capacity crunch. But it has a big factor on the politics. As people who read the newspaper might know, we took a lot of heat in the last year when we were having our service problems. and most of the heat was directed at our inability to move this bumper crop out of the state to market. And we were not any happier about that than anyone else was. People kept saying we were favoring crude oil over grain. That's not true. We make money on both of them. I think that crude oil people were probably just as upset, but were talking to us directly instead of trying to gain the sympathy of the politicians. I don't know that for a fact, but I'd be willing to bet.
Well, there's an old saying about you don't build the church for Easter Sunday, and so
Yeah.
when you have a once in 10 or 20 year crop.
Yeah. Yeah.
Any more questions? I'll make a comment. The GMOs are putting the yield up.
Yep. Well, yes, GMOs, that's true, but in general, just better and better hybrid seeds as well, made through traditional methods. I mean, they just keep getting better.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.